Many people are calling it the best meta of all time, but that doesn't stop you from having hot takes about what could be better in Marvel Snap. Zabu's nerf should be reverted. And along the same lines, 25% of the 4-drops in the game have a sub 1% play rate on untapped. 4-drops feel awful to play right now. So these are obviously two related things, right? Like, Zabo got nerfed and it was kind of subsidizing 4-drops to a pretty large degree. I think that towards the end of Zabu's lifespan, there was already like some pretty defined weaknesses in the archetype, to the point that I was surprised that they damaged Darkhawk or attempted to target Darkhawk the way that they did, because I felt that Darkhawk, while an important piece of the archetype, was not necessarily one of the more optimal choices for it at the time. I do think that people forget just how unfortunate the Zabo meta was, or not necessarily the Zabo meta was, but the kind of playstyles that Zabo being around engendered. Very Cannonball Prophecy, but with Shang-Chi just being the thing that really mattered, to the point that we had full metagames like Silky Smooth, Brood Abs, that were defined by avoiding Shang-Chi. And everyone complained about Shang-Chi at the time. Like, everyone's like, oh, they gotta do something about Shang-Chi. And then they nerfed Zabo, and Shang sort of instantly became balanced, because what it was really about was the ability to play Shang-Chi on turn 6 alongside another meaningfully large lane swinging card. So you had Zabo enabling this Shang plus something else. You play 2 cards that win lanes. Typically, the way to win a Marvel Snap game is by winning 2 out of the 3 lanes. And so Zabo enabled you to do this with, let's say Shang-Chi, Darkhawk, or what have you, right? And that play pattern was the dominant one, or at least one of the dominant ones, since Zabo has been around. My instinct is that the people who want to revert it are coming at it from a place of, there's other very broken stuff, so that makes it okay to bring Zabo back. But the one area that I would sort of hold off on that is that the best 4-drops are tech cards. They tell you what you can't do. So when a Zabo deck is a major force in the meta, Shang-Chi, Enchantress, those are major forces in the meta. And they are major forces in the meta because you are able to not pay full cost for them. And that is what enables them to sort of enforce the boundaries of what is allowed. And so a lot of Zabo decks were the police. They were saying, no, you can't do that, you can't do that, you can't do that. You have to exist within the boundaries that I set. I think it would be a bad idea to revert Zabo. I do think that 4-drops being bad in the absence of Zabo is sort of iffy. I think there are like the bottom 25% of most cost cards are pretty damn unplayable. That said, I do think that 4-drops may have been designed with Zabo in mind, post-Zabo. But also, there's 4 was actually the space where I thought the coolest things were happening for a while. When you look at how they're able to do diverse types of cards at 4, that's where it feels like the freedom really opens up. 4s are weird. 5s actually kind of aren't. I've talked about this before. And then 6s are very diverse. But you have your Jessica Jones type card, your Rescue type card, your Cull Obsidian type card, your Crossbones type card. All of these cards are asking you to complete a sort of side quest in order to get the benefit of them. But the only one that's going to see play is the one that gives you the most benefit for the least having to complete a side quest. And so for that reason, I think it's great that those cards exist. It's just they're not going to see a ton of play because there's usually a slightly better version of them. I don't necessarily think that's a problem, so to speak. Bring old Ellith back. No, please don't do that, actually. Old Ellith was a unique type of design mistake, in my opinion, where it almost didn't, there were almost no levers on the card with which to adjust it. At the current stat line, new Ellith is not that good, but if you gave it 2 points, it would get better, and if you took 2 points off, it would get worse. What happened with old Ellith was at a 6-5, they made it a 6-3 and then a 6-2, and it got better, and that is just an untenable situation when so much of the card is the ability, when the only reason to play the card is the ability, and the ability sort of precludes the power of the card actually mattering, right? Like, the way that card works, and similar to how Professor X worked, once it's on the board and doing its thing, it doesn't actually, the power of the actual card doesn't matter. There's no balance knob to turn. What matters is what has already happened. And so the only thing that matters about a card like Ellith is the effect, which makes it very difficult to balance. Whereas the current version, if current Ellith was like a 6/12, everyone would look at that and be like, wow, that's busted. But the thing making it busted would be the number. And that means there's balance levers to adjust with it. Current Ellith is a far better design than previous Elliths, and a far more fun game piece, because one thing we've learned over and over and over in Marvel Snap is when there is a game piece that says the thing that you are doing doesn't matter, no counterplay, that is bad. When there is a way to interact with a game piece like that, that is meaningful, not just be ahead, have priority, meaningful, that, I think, is far more important. With current Ellith, all you have to do is be playing something bigger than it. Power, meaningful construct on current Ellith. With previous Ellith, it was just be ahead and I guess right, and that was after they fixed the ability. Like, it was a tough time. I do not think they should bring back any form of old Ellith. I think it's time to bring Lockjaw back. 3/2 that gets -1 power every time it swaps a card. Got the idea from Alex, apparently in the show Inhumans. He got tired every time he used his powers. That's great flavor. I really like the flavor. In terms of balance, my big question for Lockjaw is this card ever going to be used to do anything ethical, or is it always going to be either broken or terrible? And I think in that case, my instinct is it'll always be either broken or terrible, right? Like, I do like that the -1 on it gives you a lever to adjust that. So, like, let's say it ended up being broken, you could go to like -2, and then suddenly you're paying a real cost for running it. But then it's just, again, it's either broken or terrible. And that's sort of the fundamental issue that Lockjaw had, is that there was no way to, like, really cleanly adjust it. When they moved it to 4 cost, effectively what they did was say, unless you super build around this, you're only rolling it twice. And that is like a 33% nerf. And that's like the smallest real nerf they can give it, is say, you can only do this effect twice now, unless you, like, really go out of your way to make it happen. And that is, I think, indicative of a card that is sort of a design issue in concept, where it's like, this is a fun thing to have in the game. I think it's probably something that makes sense. I like that this one puts a number you can adjust on the card, but I don't know if that's the kind of effect you want to be promoting at like across the board. I do think that post Thanos, I'm more comfortable with Lockjaw existing. Post Blink, I'm especially more comfortable with Lockjaw existing. But generally, I'm a little bit wary of a card that has sort of an Adam Warlock type profile, where it's like, if this card is ever good, we have to nerf it. And if it's bad, it's not very playable. And so I think I'm okay with this. If I were to do this, I would do 3/2 and it gets -2. But I do think that that is sort of a, a little bit of an interesting way to go about it. I like the flavor a lot. And I do think that, like, I'm someone, if you can justify a design in flavor terms to me, I'll be so into that. Like, I am so into that. But yeah, I think if you had this design and you kept the once per turn thing, I think it could probably be like something reasonably balanced. I just don't know if that would be fun for anybody. And I think that is something that should be taken into account. Make Electro a 2/2 that destroys 2 costs. More counters to Angela, Ravonna, Thena, and Jeff. So this was something, I remember one of the dev builds, like, not leaked or whatever, or something like that. Like, I remember people speculating that this would happen, right? Like, I remember there being, like, a big furor about, like, I think what happened was, like, if I recall correctly, a dev build picture leaked in some video where it had all the 1-drops in it and Electro wasn't in it. So people started speculating, okay, 2-drop Electra, that would mean she would kill 2 costs, I think. And I remember at the time, this was like right around when Elsa was very popular, I remember thinking, oh, that's actually a really good idea. That's really good. However, currently, I think it's less needed. And I'll tell you why in 2 words. Red Guardian. I think that's what Red Guardian is already doing. I think it'd be fine if you wanted Electra to also do that, but I think they introduced that effect into the game in a like very unique and fun and powerful way already, and it's less limited and it's more flexible, and I think that it would be a little bit weird to do it now. Because I remember at the time I was like, that is really smart. We can get rid of Angela's and Elsa's, because this is when Elsa cost 2. And it was like, oh, that's actually genius. We don't have any other way to do that. That's an interesting way of combating this meta. I'm interested to see how it works out. One of the things that really does stick out about it, though, is I think one of the things we've seen in previous history in Marvel Snap, where like a card comes out that is like meant to counter something, is that it is very often subsumed into that thing. Think about Mobius coming out and immediately just like going into every Loki deck, right? Like it seems like the kind of thing that every deck that relies on Angela, Athena, whatever, would be playing to beat the other decks that rely on Angela, Athena, whatever. And so it wouldn't actually have the effect you'd want it to have, would be my read. And that's why I like Red Guardian as a more general purpose tool that can hit this stuff, but also has other targets, so you don't feel as pigeonholed into just running it. Basically, I think Red Guardian is a much more elegant execution of this concept than buffing Electra in this way would be. That said, I'm not necessarily opposed to it on the grounds that Electra is free to play, and maybe that's cool. My instinct would be that it would be a mirror tech card for those decks, though. And so that would just be like, all right, well then what was the point of this? All we did was like make the mirror a little more inbred, and we're not really getting any benefit out of this in terms of making sure there's more counters to this stuff. Consecutive oppressive metas have burnt me out so bad that I find it hard to enjoy the game when we have an actual good meta. One thing that I think this makes me want to talk about, and I realize it's not necessarily directly germane to this topic, but it has come up a bunch recently, is how I manage this, because this is my job. And so if I ever find myself in the situation that Paper finds themselves in, I am suddenly out of a job. And so I have very like strict rules for myself regarding what I will and will not do in order to maintain that sort of thrill and desire to play the game. So what I do is when I take a day off, I don't open Marvel Snap. I don't open it. The game does not open. I don't look at it. I don't do anything. I'll be in a Discord call with my friends and they'll be like, play a friendly with me. No, I won't do that. And a lot of that is about sort of emotional self-regulation. I'll start playing and I'll be like, oh, I should go on ladder. And then it's like, what's the point of actually having a day off? But a lot of it is also about like, I want my stream time to be something special. I want to take the energy that I feel inside where I'm like, I want to go break this meta. I want to climb it. I want to take that and I want to put it into stream. I don't want to channel that off stream. I don't want to, if I feel the thrill, the fire, and I feel like people know what I'm talking about, if I feel that, I want that to be on stream. And so I organize my life in such a way that I try to make that happen as much as possible, right? And that means that I can't relate to what is being said here. It's like I felt that fire even in the bad metas, and now we're in a good one, right? It hadn't gone out for me, and I've been taking pains to make sure that I stoke it, right? And so when I think about seeing something like this, what I think is, you know what, man? Maybe you just don't like the game anymore. Like, that's fine. But I don't really think it's a question of, like, the metas, right? Because if it was a question of the metas, I think maybe you just don't like being forced to do this. And I think that, like, for a lot of content creators, they feel like they're forced to do this, to play this one game, to only do that. And because of the way I've managed myself, I don't feel that currently. Like, or I do feel like I can only play Marvel Snap, but I also feel like I want to play Marvel Snap. And because of the way I manage myself, I am able to still access that like real fire. I still get mad when I lose. Like, I feel things. I care a lot. And I think I'm worried about one day ending up like that. And I'm glad that I haven't yet, but it definitely does scare me. This is multi-part. Conquest has the opportunity to be a truly unique mode and offer a lot to players looking to play differently. It shouldn't be left to die. Now, keep in mind, this is from a person who plays and streams and makes exclusively Conquest content. So that is where we're starting here. But I did want to say, okay, well, what do you mean? Like, give me some ideas. So I asked in response, do you have any ideas? And I got one from this person and another group from another person. So let's talk about those. I don't like to armchair dev, but some that come to mind are PGs, 1 round by default, eliminate one of the tiers, lives system like Hearthstone Arena, buyback or pick up where you lost mechanic. Not sure they're right, but take a look at the mode, reevaluate what's not working. So one issue I think with Conquest is the rewards are not a real incentive. The avatars are not cool. There is nothing to make me want to play this mode, and I'm happy for that, because I consider it an inferior mode to ladder. Marvel Snap, the game is designed to be fast. Why would I want it to not be fast, right? And all of that stuff is definitely good and should probably happen. But I think if you brought that to anyone who was looking at Conquest and working on the mode, what they would say is, doesn't that just make our already non-valuable rewards even less valuable? And I think the answer to that is yes, and they just kind of have to deal with it. They should work on Conquest as QOL improvements, as opposed to, like, thinking that there's any reward people can put on the end of it that will make it worth playing or make it a satisfying experience. So I'm super with all of these, actually. I think the number one thing they should do for Conquest is understand that it is no longer the competitive mode, and focus on making it a better experience in terms of the quality of life. That would be a very smart thing to do. Some ideas: add an endless run mode or a best of 1 conquest ladder. Add points based on the results so it could have a leaderboard. Have some kind of special events, ban cards for a day or something like that. So the first two I hate, because they're exactly what I don't want out of Conquest, which is, this is not the competitive game mode anymore. You gave up on this being the competitive game mode when you didn't put any kind of MMR in the game. Like, I'm sorry. An Infinity Conquest is easier. You are playing against worse players than you are in the slightly more MMR and CL banded Silver Conquest. It's not a competitive mode, and it can't be as long as it's built like that. So if you want to keep the structure the same, there's no point. Like, what, a Conquest leaderboard showing how many times you grinded? Like, that, I don't know. I know you can levy the same thing at, like, ladder, because it is also time-gated, right? Like, everything is sort of time-gated. But Conquest would be just an explicit time gate. Like, just, oh, how many times can you beat, 3 players playing Destroy, 1 player playing Pool 1 Zoo, and then 1 actual good player playing an actual good deck? It doesn't sound compelling to me to make this the competitive mode, and that sort of goes to the crux of my issue with it, because it seems like what Conquest should actually be, and this is my big pitch, Conquest should be the for fun mode. I know that sounds weird, but that's what Conquest should be. Because so many people complain about ladder anxiety and not wanting to risk their rank and all of that. Do that in Conquest. I saw a screenshot the other day of a Marvel Snap botting service that offered 2 different services. And the first was ladder botting, which is faster and easier, but you'll be stuck in like rank 10 to rank 40. And then they also offered Conquest botting, which is explicitly marketed towards people that don't want to be stuck at rank 10 to rank 40 on ladder on the account that they are botting. Like, this is such a real psychological phenomenon that like things breaking the terms of service are marketing towards, hey, it'll be slower, but if you don't want to tank your rank, you can use Conquest to do bots. And like, I just think that fundamentally that speaks to something. Conquest is a mode where people feel safe to try stuff, right? When you want to complete your quests and you don't want to take it on ladder, you go do PGs. That speaks to something. That's what Conquest should actually be about for me. And so when I look at the third suggestion here, as opposed to the first two, which are like, to me, unworkable. You're trying to make a non-competitive mode competitive. Don't do that. The third one is really interesting, though, because, again, that is what Conquest is actually being used for. People use it to screw around, to have fun, to enjoy themselves. That would be a really interesting space to explore. Oh, we banned the 10 most popular cards. Go have fun. Have fun in the sandbox. That's kind of what I would do if I were in charge of Conquest. Second Dinner should invest heavily in playtesting to avoid the nerf meta cycle. I think this is sort of fallacious generally, which is to say, I think that the fact that Second Dinner can balance stuff after it's released is actually what makes Marvel Snap good. I think that means that they can buff old cards and make them better. And I think that means they can try stuff, and if it turns out it doesn't work, they can get rid of it. I think that the major friction with that theory of balance comes from the card acquisition in the game, which I would point to as the culprit. When people say avoid the nerf meta cycle, what they're effectively saying is, I need Second Dinner to see the future. And there's a limited ability for that to actually happen. When you look at the past 6 months, they've done a very good job at not releasing cards that need to be nerfed. They've had Cannonball nerfed, and everyone thought that it didn't need to be nerfed, and Red Hulk nerfed. That's it. Those are the cards that have been nerfed that have released in the past 6 months. So, clearly they're doing something, right? They've only nerfed, and like when you look at the months before that, it's just like a roughly infinite amount of cards that this had to happen to. We had Loki, we had Mobius, we had Ellith a bunch of times, we had Annihilus, we had Miss Marvel. Just off the top of my head, Elsa Bloodstone. Like 6 or 7 just ridiculous cards. Blob, I keep coming up with them. And so they've clearly done something, but there is a limit to what they should be attempting to do. Second Dinner in the back room should not be sitting there saying, we need to know for sure what the best deck is going to be in 6 months. Because that's ridiculous. They changed the metagame way too fast, right? Like when you look at when these cards are being made and when they release, it's like very clearly different context, right? When they were testing Athena, did Angela exist in her current form? I don't know. When they were testing Loki, did they get to the Elsa and in a Loki deck kind of thing? I don't know. Like, these are things that I suspect the answer is no to, but I actually just have no idea. What power was Sentry and the Void at when they were testing Cersei? Again, I don't know, but like when you look at like these changes that have happened over the course of the last few months, and then you look at when these cards were likely being made, I don't think it's realistic to ask them to have each of those cards up to the moment. I think the point is each of those cards need to be fixable if they end up being a problem. There needs to be a number on the card that they can change easily if those cards end up being problematic. And I think when you look at the current state of the game, the card they have failed the absolute most on, to me, is Nocturne. Because Nocturne, like Jeff, is just like the best 3-drop ever. And when you take a power off of it, it's like, oh, that's just not very good. And I think I'd probably still play 3/4 Nocturne. I don't know. But like, Nocturne reminds me a lot of Jeff, where it's like, if you made Jeff a 2/2, isn't he kind of unplayable? Like, I'm not actually sure. Maybe 3/4 Nocturne is fine. I don't actually know. But when you talk about like cards that have absolutely no levers to like change how good they are, she's the one that really comes to mind. When you look at something like Red Hulk or Cannonball, it's clear that you can do things to make them worse that don't completely obliterate the card. Cannonball getting a nerf was so out of left field because everyone was like, oh, you changed all the context around this already, right? You got rid of the Professor X thing that made it really good. Cannonball, for the record, still plenty playable, would be better at 5/8. And I think the fact that going from 5/8 to 5/7 in that context actually does kind of matter is indicative of good process, where when we talk about these cards, we don't need them to have every meta perfectly mapped out in their heads, right? I don't think that's realistic. What we do need is for every problem to be easily fixable. And I think they have failed on that count with several cards before. Thanos, for example, not an easy fix. Professor X, not an easy fix. When you talk about those cards and how they ended up getting fixed, I would imagine that it took extra time because of how hard it was to do that. And I think if you have a problem in the metagame, make sure it's easily fixable is my goal for them. Make sure that whatever the problem is, if it's a real problem backed up by the data, that you can fix it in 2 weeks. That's fine with me. Issues are when that's not true or not happening. I think Loki is another example where it's like, I wouldn't really know what to do with that card right now. If there is a world, if we live in the world where Loki is like actually a problem, actually the best deck, the numbers show it, which I don't think we live in that world, but again, it could happen. I wouldn't know how to fix him. And that's sort of the issue that you want to fix with all of these new cards. And I think, to their credit, almost every single card they've released has a meaningful knob that you could turn down just a little bit, leave the card playable, and meaningfully affect how busted it is. Athena could go to 2-0, right? That would matter. 5-6 Blink, 5-6 Cersei, all of that's impactful, that matters, that really matters to these cards. And whereas something like Loki, you just kind of have to like really figure out what you're going to do about that. That's like a whole rework, right? Thanos, it's like a whole rework. Professor X, it's like a whole rework. And that is sort of the thing that you run into that I'd like them to not run into anymore. And I think as long as there are, and they talked about this in their Hela, when they talked about their Hela nerf, they talked about adding a number on the card that they could really dial. And that's really got me thinking about this because like that's actually the important thing, right? If Hela ends up underpowered, they can change that number. If Hela ends up overpowered, they can change that number. But we can all agree that changing that number would be impactful. And I talked about this a little bit when I talked about Ellith, right? That's the thing you really want to avoid. When there's a number on a card and you're like, I'm going to cut this card's power in half, and it does nothing because that's just not how the card works, that card should never have been released. And I think that is the key thing that I would want them to focus on rather than I need you to magically predict the meta. Because I don't think that's realistic, and B, Marvel Snap is set up such that it shouldn't matter as long as the problems are fixable. So your job should be make any problem fixable. People complain too much and devs cave in. I see this one a lot, and I don't really think it's true. I complain, I don't know, I think people take what I say as complaints rather than just like, this is busted. Like, this is clearly a mistake, here is why. Like, when I talk about, like, oh, I hate Hela, it's easy to just be like, oh, KM, you hate Hela. But, like, the delineation of the reasons is pretty straightforward. I don't like Hela because I can't meaningfully interact with it. And I do like things that I can meaningfully interact with. Generally speaking, the less I can meaningfully interact with something, the less I'm going to think it's a good thing to exist in the game. I hate plenty of cards that aren't very good for the same reason. Like, I don't like Magic. I think every Magic deck is like the worst deck on Earth, and it's all hard carried by like, I guess I hope you don't Nocturne me. Like, they're all either Dock and Pray or some sort of like heinous combo, like Tribunal or Negative or Wong or some mixture of those three. And it's all just like, ha 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 ha, I hope I don't get the rug pulled out from under me while I'm doing my combo that you can't interact with. I just, like, none of her decks are very good. And they're all very annoying. Like, that's basically my thesis of why I don't like Magic. But I would never in a million years suggest that they need to nerf her. Magic is an amazing, amazing, amazing card for the game. I hate how those decks play, but people love them. And it's really good that those people have an outlet, right? Like, I'm very happy that, like, if you want to be like Johnny, combo gamer in Marvel Snap, you can do that, and she's like your best friend for that. That rocks. I would never in a million years suggest we needed to nerf it. And I guess, if it somehow ended up broken, but that seems like particularly unlikely. I think Magic is like kind of genius design, but I just hate how she plays. When it comes to people complaining and the devs caving, I think there's a bunch of stuff that gets complained about that the devs don't cave on because it's not good. And the stuff where you look at like someone like me making a video about how busted something is, and then that thing getting nerfed, that should not be evidence that the devs are doing incorrect things. It should be evidence that I was right. It was busted, right? Like, I was right. It was a problem. It actually was a problem. And instead, it gets phrased as like, oh, these people are just complaining for the sake of complaining. They don't know what they're talking about. But like a lot of the time, people can know what they're talking about when they're like, oh, this sucks. I get it. It's very easy to look at every complaint and just be like, they're just mad because it beats them. That's totally true. It does happen. Like, I'm not immune to this, right? But I think a lot of the time when someone identifies a problem and is able to explain why they think it's a problem, and then every response is just skill issue, get good. And then the devs are like, actually, this is a problem. And then your response as the skill issue guy is to be like, everyone just needs to get good like me. I think that's just dumb. I think that's just like kind of dumb. I'm not going to lie. I think like the day before Professor X got nerfed, I saw a post in like the Marvel Snap Twitter group that was like, I can't believe people complain about this card. Prof X Cannonball is so telegraphed and so easy to beat. And it's like, if you look at any stats site, it's like very clearly among the best things to be doing in the game. Like very clearly the top tier thing to be doing. And it's like, it's so easy to beat. And it's like, that's just sort of not true. But I think there's this thing that happens, I believe I've talked about this, where people conflate is imbalanced with cannot be beaten. And I think people need to understand that, like, imbalanced in a card game is like a 57% win rate, meaning it loses like 43% of the time. Like, imbalanced in a card game is, like, if I had a deck that was 60-40 into everything, that's the most busted deck in any card game I've ever played. That's a ridiculous thing. And it's still losing 40% of the time. And I think people don't really get that because they're used to things being like Imba or OP in like a 90-10 kind of way. But in a card game with this much variance, if you are 60-40 into something, that is awful. That is terrible. That is a ridiculously bad thing to have exist in your game. And so I think there's this thing that happens where like anytime anyone's complaining about something, you're like, well, I beat that like a decent amount of the time. It's like, yeah, of course you do. Of course you do. It's not like it's unbeatable. None of this stuff is unbeatable. Marvel Snap is actually a very balanced game. However, is it a little too strong? Probably. Second Dinner's minuscule support of competitive Marvel Snap has nothing to do with wanting to keep the game approachable to the masses and casual. It likely has to do with creating levers that gives the community more control to create competitive parameters. This issuance of agency to the community provides no monetary value to SD. Therefore, since competitive Marvel Snap doesn't make them any significant money, SD isn't interested in investing into it, potentially ever. Boy, and people say I use a lot of big words. Okay, so basically what this person is saying is the reason Second Dinner doesn't invest into competitive Marvel Snap is because it doesn't make them any money. Not because they don't think that's how they want to market the game. I would posit that it is both of those things. They market the game as a casual experience. Having the faces of the game be turbo sweats there's not a lot of verisimilitude there. How's that for a big word? When you have this situation where esports as a concept is kind of like losing money, like in the current climate, not a very advisable thing. As a concept was very sort of kept afloat by like a zero interest rate venture capital type economy, which we no longer are in. I find it hard to believe that seeing this stuff as valuable would be particularly meaningful. Now, I know this guest, is someone who deeply cares about Marvel Snap Esports and wants to be like a commentator for Marvel Snap Esports and wants to run tournaments for Marvel Snap Esports, and as far as I'm aware, has. I don't think that it would be a game changer if they added tournament mode, right? Like, when you talk about what would be good for the game, that would be good for me. That would be good for you. Like, it would get viewers, right? It would make a more watchable experience when people do tournaments. That would be good for me and you. We'd get like decent viewership boosts out of it. It wouldn't be good for the game, though. Like, or I see no evidence connecting that to being good for the game. How would it be better for them to juice viewers, right? They can juice viewers by doing effectively zero cost Twitch drops, or they could juice viewers by spending a lot of dev time making this mode. And I think it seems like very clear to me which one of these has like greater effective value, right? Like, you are getting more for less if you just do Twitch drops every month. Like, it would have the same effect. I would argue Twitch drops probably have an even greater effect at a lower cost. And I get that, because like, I'm someone who's run tournaments. I'm someone who has commentated tournaments. I'm someone who has been flown halfway around the world to do a tournament. Like, this is something that I get why you want this, but when I look at it from the perspective of the game as a whole, I kind of just see it as like a handout to me, you know? Like, that's who that's for. It's for me. It's for you. And why would they bother? Like legitimately, how would that help them more than just doing Twitch drops? Because that's what it would function as. It would function as a viewership driver on Twitch. That's what it would do. And I think people can argue, you know, okay, it'll give something like people to get invested in or what have you. But I'm just not really sure that's true. When you look at the biggest Marvel Snap creators, they're not top tier competitive players. They're not trying to be top tier competitive players. When they are, it's, you know, like, they're good players. I don't want to sit here and be like they're not. Dexter's like ranked 69 right now. He's dope. Darrow's amazing. But when you look at these people, they don't set out to do that. That's not their brand. That's not their approach. They set out to explore. And I think one thing that having a tournament meta, as like the guy who like is the meta guy, I have realized this. Having a meta enforced in that way leaves less room for people to explore. For this reason and the previous, I think it just probably, if you were working at Second Dinner, I think if you brought this to them, they'd be like, why would we spend all the time and money on that to juice some Twitch views when we could just do Twitch drops? And I would find it kind of hard to argue against that. I think you could argue for like community and things of that nature. I think you could, but I think it would be a hard argument to make. And I think the fact that the argument would be that hard to make means that it would sort of necessarily get triaged downward on the priority list when there are so many more important things that need to be done in this game. And so that's sort of my read on, like, that's what I would be feeling if I were the person internal there. I'd be like, I just don't really understand why we would want to do this. And I think that there's like possible negative knock-on effects in addition when we talk about like a constricting meta, and possible positive ones that I really want to be true, but I don't want to sit here and make my argument for this just entirely me huffing hopium. I guess I just sort of feel like this is something that people in my orbit really want. But at the same time, I think one thing that competitive players need to recognize is that they don't balance for us. They don't make the game for us. They don't do that. That's just not what they do. And I think that this would be the kind of thing that is for a segment of the population that is already kind of hyper invested. And if you want to say maybe it's good that you, like, you know, communicate to the hyper invested people that you care and you want that for them, maybe. But is it worth more than dev hours on something like, I don't know, fixing the fact that my game crashes when I play Debris? Like, probably not, right? All right, y'all. Thank you so much for making it through that extra long episode, I think. I'm looking at the recording timer right now. It's at like 42 minutes. I don't know how it's going to end up in the actual thing. I'm guessing maybe I cut out like 5 question mark minutes of dead time and we still end up with the longest one I've ever done. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. If you made it that far, I am extremely grateful. They're watching me yap for however long this ends up being. I'm KM Best. You have been phenomenal, and I will see you in the next one.